it's one of many serial studies that have been done in the Greater Hobart region. So there were 3-city studies in Perth, in Newcastle, and Tasmania in 1961 and 1981. But subsequent to that, we haven't done the 3-city studies again. So there was another study in Hobart in 2001 and then 2009, which I did during my PhD. And now we've repeated this at a 2019 time point. In Newcastle, they've done subsequent assessments in 1996 and 2011. But what we've shown, in keeping with our previous study, is that the prevalence and incidence of MS in Hobart have continued to increase. We continue to have the highest frequencies in all of Australia, in keeping with the latitudinal gradient. I'm not sure if your readers or viewers are familiar with the latitudinal gradient of MS, but basically there's a recognized distribution of MS frequency across the world such that it gets higher the further away from the equator you go. Consequently, Hobart has the highest frequency in the country compared to the far north of the country in Queensland. New Zealand has high frequencies. The far north of England and Canada have high frequencies. And so this is well in keeping with that. We found a marked increase in the incidence. So the prevalence is increasing as we typically see due to, case longevity and general longevity in the population. But another thing that is really interesting is the standardized mortality ratio. So typically MS cases for the longest time have had a higher mortality rate than the general population. And what we found in this study, interestingly, is that the standardized mortality ratio is now 1. So effectively, the mortality rate among people with MS in our sample is equivalent now to the general population. And this continues some trends that we've seen in some other settings, like in Scandinavia and in Wales. They did some studies of the SMR from the 1980s, 1990s. And what we've basically done, continuing the standardized mortality ratio assessment to 2019, is we've seen the SMR to continually decrease over time to now it's at perfect parity with the general population. And we cautiously attribute this to potentially the advent of really highly effective disease-modifying therapies that came online in 1996, and particularly some of the second-line ones that have come out in the last couple of decades that have been highly effective. They've reduced the relapse rate down to very low. We've now got some DMTs that are actually effective at reducing disability, including in people with progressive MS phenotypes. So those things combined, so the increasing incidence as well as reduced mortality, increasing case longevity, have meant that we've now got very high frequencies, or continuingly high frequencies in Tassie. Another thing which you might be of interest and goes to the latitudinal gradient comment that I brought up before is the canonical thing that you see within Australia, I should say. You may not know it in where you live, but in Australia, the thing that we've been able to say for since the 1960s is that Hobart has about double the frequency of Newcastle. So Hobart's at latitude 43, Newcastle's in the mid 30s, and then Queensland, you're looking at latitudes of around 13 to whatever. Basically, what we've generally seen is that the frequencies of MS in Hobart are about twice that of Newcastle and 7 times that of tropical northern Queensland, set up by the Great Barrier Reef and stuff. What we've shown looking at the literature is that basically the prevalence and incidence in Hobart compared to the most recent surveys that have been done in Newcastle are now at parity, which suggests that between those two sites, the latitudinal gradient seems to have disappeared. And we've described this in our presentation. We've also described this in more detail in our JNNP publication. And we are now very much keen to assess the frequencies of MS in some other locations, including in Queensland, which actually has not been quantitatively assessed in the same fashion as this since the 1980s. And so we're very keen now to undertake an updated prevalence assessment in Queensland to see whether or not that attenuation of the gradient is just particular to the Hobart-Newcastle comparison, or if it is nationwide, because that may then speak to some things like behavior changes. One of the things that we think underlies the latitudinal gradient, in addition to things like potentially Epstein-Barr virus and smoking distribution and ethnic distribution, is the sun exposure gradient. So, with higher latitude, the winter ambient UV is much lower, but potentially if people are significantly modifying their behavior, including supplementing with vitamin D and altering their sun-related behaviors systematically across the population, you could see an absolute marked abrogation or attenuation of the latitudinal gradient. So these are things that we hope to explore further.